diretso na tayo sa ating second in the meantime gusto ko pong pasalamatan yung ating mga sponsors sa sa conference na ito. Ang conference po na ito ay bunsod ng isang proyekto na pinupondohan ng Miserior at katulong din natin, kaagapay din natin, nagbigay ng suporta ang Energy Development Corporation or EDC at ang United Nations Development Program, UNDP. Okay, so let's proceed with our second plenary presentation. Our second speaker will be talking about disinformation and conflict resolution. She is Attorney Odina Batnag, and is also known as Dana to her friends. She's a senior journalist and a lawyer. For more than 20 years, she was the Manila Bureau reporter of GG Press, a Japanese news agency. And she honed her skills as an investigative journalist working for the local media like the Manila Times, the Philippine Graphic, and the Manila Chronicle, where she worked for 11 years before joining the foreign press in 1997. A few years ago, she graduated from the UP College of Law, and she is currently working as a lawyer at the Commission of Human Rights of the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Attorney Dana Batnag.
Good afternoon.
Oh, we lost her. Dana?
Nagkamali ng pindot, sorry. Good afternoon. Napindot ko yung mute eh. Today I'm going to talk about disinformation and reality. Pwedeng pa-start na mag-share ng slide. Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about disinformation, what's it doing to our democracy, and how we can counter it in our everyday lives. Next slide. So, ang question is, what do you do when someone says it's raining? Do you look out the window to check for rain? Or do you check your social media apps? Or ask people in your group chat? There was an earthquake last week, and a lot of people in Metro Manila felt it. It was really damaging in Abra. Question is, how many of you took out your phones and checked Facebook, Twitter, or your group chats to find out if there was an earthquake or not, instead of checking sa mainstream media or sa Feebolgs kung may earthquake? So, next slide. Okay, so here are some tweets that shows how often how people actually check social media instead of feeling the earthquake. Judging from these tweets, it seems it has become common for people to turn to social media in times of a natural disaster, or at least in this case during an earthquake. Next slide. A few decades ago, which seems like a lifetime ago now, we used to get our information from the mainstream news media. People would turn on the radio or the television to find out what happened. How many of you, I guess from the audience, there are still a lot of us who used to turn on the radio during a typhoon, to find out which areas were flooded or which streets were impassable. Nowadays, at least for those 30 or below, a lot of people get their information more from social media than from the mainstream news media. And there's actually good reason for this. In my personal experience, mas mabilis ang social media in reporting events than the news media. One particular example was there was a typhoon in Lanao before, and my friends on Facebook were saying na nasa bubong na yung kamag-anak nila sa Iligan. It took at least an hour before I found that news sa Twitter. sa mainstream news media na nasa Twitter. Hindi pa nare-report sa radyo. So, that's one reason why I also check social media. Kasi mas mabilis ang posting ng mga tao, mas real time. Next slide. So, uh, the Reuters digital news report shows that 73% of Filipinos now get their information from social media. 80% of Filipinos access news through their smartphone. But what if social media does not confirm your experience? Next slide. So, paano yung dun sa earthquake? What if when you went to social media, sabi ng mga kaibigan nyo, hindi nila naramdaman yung earthquake? How would you feel about it? Would you feel that it was less real for you? Will other people's opinions negate your own personal experience? Okay, as I mentioned earlier, the mainstream news media used to be the main source of information. It was the purveyors of truth, the gatekeepers of knowledge. Now the internet changed all that. It gave us an easy means to look for information. The problem here is, however, it's up to us to determine whether or not that information is true. It's up to us to determine what value to give, what weight to give to the information that we find on the internet. But do we have guidance when we look for information, or do we just take what's there? Unfortunately, kasi walang malinaw na guidance, it has allowed people to choose what to believe, to determine for themselves what is true or not. Sabi ng kaibigan ko naniniwala ako sa kaibigan ko. You can see this in the discussions about martial law. Were people killed and tortured? Was there an economic crisis? I have talked to people who grew up in the provinces who insist that martial law was benign because neither they nor anyone they know suffered. No one they knew was tortured or killed, and they didn't go hungry. And truth, as far as they were concerned, was limited to their personal experience. Ang hirap i-counter nun Kakausapin mo, so anong memories niyo ng martial law? Okay lang, tahimik naman. Nasaan po ba kayo nun? Nasa Samar ako nun So, walang access sa media, or, well, at time media was controlled. So, information about things that will make government look bad was very, very limited. So, kung wala kang kakilala na na-torture, wala kang access sa alternative press, at hindi ka nahirapan, hindi kayo nagutom, you would think that martial law was benign. But does that mean, because their personal experience was that martial law was actually good to them, does that mean na we can negate yung experiences ng iba? Next slide. So, balik sa earthquake. Will it feel less real to you? If there was an earthquake, but no one else felt it, ngayon, you can be trolled on social media for saying that there was one. But would that earthquake feel less real to you just because no one else felt it? So, the juxtapose po ulit sa martial law. If only 1% of the population were tortured and killed, does that make their pain less real? Mas hindi ba masakit if you have 99% saying, that's not true, it didn't happen? Okay, next slide. Okay, why am I saying this? Because my point is that reality is the product of mediation. It cannot be just one person's reality that will be more important than the rest of us. Neither can it be the majority, di ba? Na ito yung totoo, so ito yung experience namin, so wala yung experience mo, di ba? So, what will that make yung mga massacres, yung Japida massacre, di ba? Minority ang Muslims, can we ignore it? Can we say na it did not happen? Tao na ako nun, pero hindi ko alam yun Is my truth more important than someone else's because that someone belongs to a minority? Diba? So, okay. Reality is made up of shared experiences. It's a combination of personal truths, and we negotiate on the weight that must be given to our separate and different experiences. So, parang medyo theoretical siya. What negotiation, reality, why do we need to define what reality is? Because this is how we live our everyday lives now. Sometimes, especially on social media, we find ourselves negotiating or arguing over what is real and what is true. Diba? And why? Why is that? Because disinformation has permeated our lives in such a way that even historical facts can now be denied. Diba? In the past 2 years, we've heard people, I've actually met people who say COVID isn't real. It's just another name for the common cold. But if reality is the product of negotiation, in the sense that we must find a way of merging our personal experiences without choosing one over the other, is there a guide for negotiation? How do we counter disinformation when such disinformation is linked to the other party's well-being? Why do I say well-being? Ganito. In 2016, there was this person who was trolling, I think Lenny. So, all caps. So, somebody I know from the Duterte camp message the person. Sabi niya, bakit ka naman galit na galit? Sabi niya, kasi dati nagko-comment ako, pero nung hindi all caps, walang pumapansin sa comment ko. So, nung naging troll siya na all caps, tapos galit na siya palagi. Parang all of a sudden, napapansin ng comment siya. So, nagkaroon siya ng relevance. So, what if yung trolling mo is connected na dun sa mahalaga sa akin? Yung disinformation that I peddle actually makes me feel relevant. Paano natin ika-counter yun? Diba? I don't have an answer for that. Next slide. Instead, I'll tell you about some of the very, very basic means on finding out what is factual or not. And this, I think, is something that we need to do in our everyday lives. When we get text messages from friends or when we pass on information. Okay, so first, what is the source of the information? Ito yung mga basic. So, is it a government website? Tignan nyo, kasi makikita mo naman, if it's a government website, there's a .gov. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's a .gov and there's a .ph to put it kung saan yung country. Yun. And then, bakit mahalaga ng government website? This is not to say that government does not engage in this information. Sometimes they do. But since it has an obligation to the people, there is an assumption that government can be trusted. Okay, next slide. Is it the website of an educational institution? So I gave us an example, UP Open University. There's a .edu that tells you sa Cambridge, there's a .ac. It's an academic website. Sorry. Okay, next slide. Is it an organization? So there's a .org sa UN. ASEAN has an ASEAN.org. Or is it a commercial entity? So there's .com. So ito, 7-Eleven.com. So it's 7-Eleven Philippines kasi may .ph. Okay, next slide. So, bakit? Why is it important kung sino yung source ng information? The point is accountability. How accountable are these different sources of information? For example, kung may makita kayong libelous dun sa website ng UP, you know it's UP. You know who to sue. You know where to have the summons or the warrant of arrest delivered kung kailangan, right? Pero kung some .com website lang na walang address, kasi that's why you have to look at the contact us portion ng isang website. Sino sila? Nasaan ang address nila? Otherwise, how do you know pag may sinabi silang mali that turns out to be wrong? How do you know that you can make them accountable? Next slide. So what if the information came from the Facebook post of a stranger? Or if it was passed on from a group chat with no attribution? Maraming sources ng disinformation come from group chat nowadays because we trust the people in a group chat. Diba? This happened to me before. Isang friend ko may pinas ko na information about vaccination. And at the time, a lot of people were looking for vaccine. So, pinasa ko doon sa iba. Tapos somebody told me, uy, scam yan. Nagpasa ako ng ng scam. So, tinanong ko yung friend ko kasi very diligent yan about checking his information. Sabi ko, chinek mo ba yun bago mo pinasa sa akin? Hindi. Kasi mukha namang legit. Ganon. So, binawi ko agad doon sa lahat ng pinagpasahan ko. Days later, it turned out na legit naman siya. But it happens to us because we trust the sources. We tend to trust the information without knowing whether the information was verified. So, ang problema, if you don't know the source, the actual source of the information, why do you believe the information to be true? Kasi we think the source is our friend. So we need to think beyond. Parang kasi that's how phishing works. Yung na-hack yung account ng friend mo, tapos ite-text ka, di ba? Yung na-hack, I'm sure you must have experienced this, na-hack yung email niya. I am now in the US and I am trapped here or usually Europe or some exotic sounding country and I am trapped here. I lost my visa, so please send me dollars. Ganon. That was a phishing scam a few years ago. So sometimes it happens kasi, ay, walang way to contact, pero email niya to eh. Ganon. So, let me digress a little and tell you another story. A few years ago, I covered a kidnapping case. The police at first managed to track the suspects, but then they disappeared. At one point, the police officer in charge held a press conference to tell us that they were terminating the investigation. So, kaming mga reporter na nag-cover sa kanya, we could not believe it. Before this, he was giving us regular briefings at night over whiskey, pero puro off the record. And then all of a sudden, sabi niya, wala na, officially, you can quote me, press conference talaga. Tapos na to. But then, the following day, after a few days, sabi niya, nahuli na namin yung suspects. So parang, ano nangyari? Bakit ganun? Nag-press conference ako kasi we wanted them to be caught off guard. We wanted them to relax. So, because you reported na nag-relax sila, na tapos na kami, na hindi na namin sila habulin, nag-relax sila. So, nahuli namin sila. Now, the question is, was that disinformation? Diba? Next slide. So, yun. Was it disinformation? Next slide. That was a government official. Was it justified? Nahuli niya eh. So, sa atin ba, in our book, is the means more important? Diba? Does the end justify the means? If you say it was justified, then when is information justifiable? For whose sake can we tell lies? Diba? How do we know? Parang, okay, pag nagpalit ng gobyerno at nagpalit na yung justification, pwede bang magpalit din ng ginagawa? Next slide. So, at the start, I said it was important to counter disinformation. The deluge of information and disinformation has weakened trust in our institutions and isolated us in our chosen echo chambers, circles that confirm our beliefs regardless of how truthful these are. So, here are some basic rules on how to deal with information on our day-to-day lives. Okay, next slide. Check your facts. Where is the source? As I said kanina, anong klaseng website yan? Anong website yan? Sino yung source? Kasi, bakit mahalaga kung sino yung source? Expert ba siya? Is this information something na is qualified to speak on? Ganon. We tend to trust information that is passed on by our friends, often without checking if they had verified the information before passing it on. So, binanggit ko na to kanina, di ba? This is why phishing works, because we are more likely to click on a link when the text message came from a friend that we trust than if it came from a stranger. But the question is, how knowledgeable is your friend on the information that was passed on to you? So, expert ba siya sa subject or did she Did he or she took the effort to ask who the source of the information was? Some examples of this were the messages passed around are about COVID, about how infectious it was, whether or not it was airborne nung panahon hindi pa determined dyan, or the capacity rate of some hospitals in Metro Manila. Noon may mga ano na, puno na yung ganitong hospital, may mga kumakalat na mga text messages. Some turned out to be true and some turned out to be false. I've had a friend before na nag-away kami kasi sabi niya, hindi totoo yan. Tapos pinasa niya sa akin yung link ng isang YouTube channel. So, kala mo talaga, ano siya, knowledgeable siya. But when I check dun sa ano niya, credentials niya, hindi siya doktor, hindi siya scientist, he's a nurse. But he talks very convincingly about COVID and what to do. Pero karamihan tama, pero may mga several percent na mali. So, pagka hindi mo finilter out, you'd be passing on disinformation. So, ang tanong is, if you can be held liable for this information that you passed on, will you still pass it on? I mean, minsan kasi madali, okay, COVID lang yan eh. Pero what if libelous pala yung pinapass on mo? Tapos, naghanap ng nagpapass on yung source at sabi niya, ilalibel ko kayo lahat. Diba? Tapos, ay, pinasa ko lang eh, pero why did you check? Pwedeng negligence yun. Next slide. How do you know that it's a fact? Okay, ang problema ngayon minsan, even the fact that the world is round is not a fact for some who believe that the world is flat. You know, because none of us are experts or anything. There are many subjects where we can't say for certain that the information is true. So that's for COVID, ang example like COVID, the latest variants, the medicines to treat this. Pero sa dami ng disinformation, for some people, it also includes historical facts. Again, such as the torture and killings that happened during martial law. So balik to sa question, how do you know it's a fact? Well, for COVID, for diseases, go to credible websites like the World Health Organization. Diba? For martial law, may mga cases na mga na-file. There's remember, 10,000 victims filed and won a class suit against the Marcoses in Hawaii. So may mga cases against the Marcoses and against their cronies where the facts were debated and actually settled. Nasa internet din lahat yun. Next slide. Make Google your friend. Even pictures can be checked. So, halimbawa, may isang magandang post sa Facebook. But was that made by a real person? You can check the pictures kasi ngayon, kahit na pictures, ninanakaw na at pinopost. So, akala mo totoo yung account kasi may picture. Dati kasi noon, nung simula ng Facebook, taking account na kasi walang picture. Ganun, pusa ang nakalagay. Pero ngayon, akala mo tunay na tao. Tapos pag chinek mo, artista pala or someone else. You can Google it. But also, you have to be careful sa Google. Kasi, like for example, if you Google vaccines and autism, ang una mong makikita, meron ng mga ano na, yung link ng vaccines to autism has been debunked. Pero meron pa ring site na nagsasabi na, pero inalis ng CDC yung link na yun eh. Binago yung subhead. So parang, naku, ano kaya ang totoo dito, di ba? So that's why you need to check, okay, educational website ba yan? Government website ba yan? Is it the World Health Organization? You need to have a certain guideline ng dapat at least yung mga kilalang institutions yung kinukuha mo. Hindi just because it confirms with your beliefs kahit na hindi mo kilala kung sino yung nagsasabi, siguro totoo kasi ito yung pinapaniwalaan ko eh. Ganon. Okay. The right to information is actually a human right. Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes the freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. It's also in our Constitution. It recognizes the right of the people on information on matters of public concern. Section 4 says that no law shall be passed abridging the freedom of speech, of expression, or of the press. Bakit ganun? Why is it considered a human right? Because people have the right to information so that they can use the information to make better decisions about their lives. So that you can choose how to live your life. But, sorry, Next slide. Okay, that's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay. So, and then next slide's Constitution. Yeah, okay. So, so that you can choose how to live your life. Okay. Yung palang kausap ko, sinungaling kasi nag-estafa na pala siya several times. Kasi nakita mo yung estafa cases na convicted siya several times. But I still want to deal with him. Kasi gusto ko siyang kausap eh. So at least, di ba, you know what you're doing. Even if people would say your decision is wrong, it was based on facts. The question is, what happens when the information provided is false or misleading? Balik tayo dun sa kwento ko about the press conference. Simple lang yun kasi nahuli naman yung kriminal. Pero what if a government official lies because that person wants people to make decisions that will be favorable dun sa office ng government officials na yun, ng official na yun? What does it make of the right of the people to information? Next slide. So, that's where I end. This presentation was meant to provoke, not to make conclusions. Countering disinformation is everyone's responsibility, for it affects all of us, although in different ways. I only want to point out what disinformation does and how our reality is the product of negotiation. Going back to the example of the earthquake, the fact that I felt the earthquake, but others did not, does not make the earthquake less real. Nor should other people's experiences, however different, negate mine, because truth needs context. That said, I want to leave you with these words from the UN Secretary General. We didn't get here where information seems to be everywhere, instantly. We got here because of the little lies that we allowed to be told, that we allowed ourselves to tell, because we said that the end justifies the means. We are not going to get out of here easily, but we have to start somewhere. And this is where we start. We have to make lying wrong again. Because in the end, disinformation is just a nice word, it's just a longer word for lying. That's what it is. Ang problema is that we have allowed people to tell it. And so now it's all over us. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Can we please ask you to stay a little longer because we have Q&A. Can you
Sabi ko kasi ayaw.
sandali lang. We have time for 2-3 questions. You may raise your hand if you want to ask a question, or you may write them in the in the chat box. Ganda pa naman ng kwento ni Dana. May nagtataas pa ng kamay or any reaction to what she said.
Wala, tahimik siya lahat. Okay, somebody asked, ano
Yeah.
yung context na sinabi ng UN Secretary General yung quote niya? Actually, it was a longer report kasi ang sinasabi niya is about disinformation and how it's being used by authoritarian governments. Yung ganon. So, mas more on disinformation in societies. And, yun. Mas malaking context. Kaya lang kasi parang ang feeling ko masyadong complicated if I go in there. I wanted to point out na it's not just governments who are responsible. We're all responsible kasi everyone does it in a way. I mean, yung pagpapasa-pasa ng disinformation. And nakita ko rin kasi yon ang nangyayari. Ang problema sa disinformation is that a lot of it is sometimes part of information. So, okay, kunwari, ano ba? Tama yung isang policy. Tama yung policy. Example lang to ha. Tama yung policy about China. We're just being independent. Mali yung position natin to sue China over the West Philippine Sea. Kasi kaya naman sa kaya naman sa bilateral negotiation yan. Okay, that seems true, right? But as a reporter who has covered that issue a lot, sinasabi ng DFE no, ilang beses na kami nakikipag-usap sa China, and the problem with bilateral negotiations is that they always want to start with, it's a Chinese lake. The West Philippine Sea is a Chinese lake. So, pero ilang beses mo ulit-ulitin yung sinabi na namin yun, ni-report na namin yun eh. But you'd have somebody on social media saying this over and over again. And parang as a reporter, na-report ko na yung news na yun, hindi ko na pwede ulitin yun kasi old news na yun. Right? So, and also, one thing about this information is that it's free. So, people are paid to put out this information, but people can access it without cost. Pero sa media, you have to pay. You want good analysis, you want to read the New York Times, you have to pay. Okay, there's another question. Sahara. Teka, Ray, yung ay official na naglay.
Wag na yun. Let's not go into that.
Also, matagal na siya retired. That was an old case.
Uh-huh.
And also, it's not in media now.
Okay. Dana, let's
Marawi
yes.
Siege. How can we get the right information about various issues in Marawi Siege when the state does not want to investigate and provide the space to generate the right information for the displaced families to move forward? Yes, that's not just a good question, that's a problem. So, ang problema, for example, sa Marawi Siege is that how can you even get the information? Can you get it from the media? Hindi makapasok ang media doon, di ba? So, you will have to get it from the residents. Pero, paano mo makukuha from the residents? Either the residents talk about it and they reach out to the press para masulat yung information, or somebody goes in there. Ngayon, nakakapasok na. Pero noon, ang hirap pumasok sa Marawi. I haven't been there. So, during the siege, nakapunta ako ng Marawi long before the siege. So, how can we get the right information? How can we get the right of information or clarification lang? The right of information or the right information?
The right information, I suppose. Yeah.
Kasi yung is the right of information. So, the right information, so, balik ka dun sa ano, how do you judge if it's the right information? Okay, so ang tatanungin mo, sino ba yung source at ano yung reasons niya for giving this information to me? So, okay, syempre, ang best source are the residents. Paano yung dun sa rebuilding? Residents ba yung best source dun sa kind of rebuilding that should be done? They're one of the sources. Pero kailangan mo rin ng experts kung, for example, may mga disaster area ba dyan? Is it earthquake prone? Yung mga ganon. Although alam din ng residents yun. But that means you will have to qualify yung information from the residents with information from the experts. And then ma-manage mo ngayon yun, i-contextualize mo pa rin further so what government can do and what government wants to do. But then we're talking about two kinds of government. There's the local government, there's the central government. So yeah, that used to be the job of media. Now, when media cannot do it, then someone else has to do it. But, so sino yung magsasabi noon? Minsan NGOs. Kasi sila yung pwedeng maka-access dun sa all sources of information. All facts are true, but not all truths are facts. Okay. Teka, so, Abdul, has that been answered?
Yeah, but still thinking a lot of issue right now in my mind because we have a lot of issue right now in Marawi after almost 6 years of being displaced. And the right to know is part of the mechanism for the transitional justice. I think the right to know, the right to justice, and the right to know, we've been deprived for 6 years. 21 billion according to the government ang napunta sa Marawi. Pero until na wala pang nakabalik sa amin. Yung mga looting na nangyari, yung mga missing and dead, etc. So the point here is the narrative of how the Marawi transpired ay narrative ng security sector. Pero yung narrative ng mga IDP until now ay hindi nagagawa dahil nga very sensitive yung issue. Kaya encountering this information, napakabigat sa loob namin, 94,000 individuals na paano kami makakaget ng right information. Sino yung may accountability ngayon sa pagiging displaced namin? Even what happened to Marawi, yung very basic bakit nangyayari nga ang Marawi siege ay hindi nasasagot. So what I'm trying to say, yeah, may nasagot doon, pero until now we are still seeking for the right information why Marawi siege happened, may accountability ba, international humanitarian law ba ay may violation, looting, etc. na mga issue. Until now ay big pa rin yung treatment ng government sa amin on the right information. But nevertheless, thank you for the some insight.
Pero ano yan yan yung isang malaking problema. The stories of the people are never told.
Yeah.
They are told as breaking news, but after a while, the media moves on, which is why I think the people should be taught to tell their stories themselves. Kasi ang problema rin sa media, may pagka-centric, the big media companies are by nature Manila-centric. Okay.
Yeah.
So, mas focused ang local media. Diba? But ang local media naman, hindi naman minsan naririnig nationwide. So, yun yung isang imbalance sa atin na we also, that's part of the weaknesses and the failure of media. Ang problema una is the definition of news. It has to be new. But news is not always new. News is also what's important. But a lot of media people sometimes forget. Ito yun, tinanong ko sa editor ko noon, sabi kasi ng editor ko noon, there was a series of rapes in Marikina long ago. Sabi ko, pang ilang rape na yan, news pa ba yan? Sabi ng boss ko, the fact that people are still being raped is news. Hindi kasi marami nang nangyaring patayan, less na yung value ng patayan. Di ba mas malaking balita kung tuloy-tuloy yung patayan? So, dapat ganun din yung pagtingin sa Marawi, right? Di ba dapat malaking balita yun na 6 years later, ang dami pa natin hindi alam.
Yeah.
So, but ganun yan when people fail, when the state or when media fails to address your needs, unfortunately, kayo yung kailangang kumilos. Kayo yung kailangang to tell your story because in the first place, you're the one who can best tell your story. Diba? At walang form dapat ang story. I used to tell people, kahit na mali ang grammar niyan o kahit na hindi English yan, that's their language, diba? That's their tone, that's the color. So you shouldn't let others tell you how to tell your story. Kasi experience mo yan. So balik tayo. Yung experience ko, tapos sasabihin ko, yung experience ko is better than yours. Hindi ko na-experience yung earthquake, na-experience mo yung earthquake. So, bawasan mo ba yung pain ng earthquake? Kasi ako hindi ko na-experience. That's why we need to mediate. That's why we need to contextualize, diba? That's why reality is negotiable.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a question from Sahara Ali. Ma'am, you were raising your hand earlier. Technicals, pwede bang pakibuksan yung mic ni Miss Ali?
Okay, good afternoon, ma'am.
Yes.
Hello? Naririnig na po ako?
Yes,
Okay.
we can hear you now.
Ma'am, I am from the Bangsamoro Women Commission. Since now we are talking about misinformation and disinformation, can you give us some advice? Kasi nga po, our office is, yung office po namin ay minsan sa amin pumupunta yung direct na biktima ng gender-based violence. So papaano po natin maiwasan like yung mga, kasi may mga sumbong kasi sila na hindi natin maiwasan. It's either totoo ba siya or paninira lang. Can you give us some advice po kung paano natin yun siya ma-handle po?
I always, sa amin kasi sa CHR, di ba, minsan may mga nagtatanong din. May mga
Yes po.
So, first, we always try to advise to seek counseling kasi importante yung psychological damage. Regardless of whether or not the accusation is true, may psychological pain yan. Pangalawa, sabi ko, hinihingi ko pa rin yung kabilang side. Kasi ang sinasabi ko, again, responsibility, rights must always be countered with responsibilities. Diba? So, ano ba yung right mo, pero ano ba yung responsibility mo? So, ano ba yung claim ng kabilang side? Ganon. So, for example, minsan malinaw vowsy, diba? So, binubugbog siya ng asawa. So, parang pagka ganun, sasabihan na namin na kung pwede, pag-blatter nyo, kasi nag-aano na ako ng evidence in preparation for a court case. Ipa-platter nyo, ipaano nyo sa barangay. So, ang question mo is how do you know if it was disinformation? So, magtatanong ka ng witnesses. Paano nangyari yun? Kaya lang, minsan ang policy walang witnesses eh.
Yes.
Diba? A lot of yung violence of women, walang witnesses. So,
Yes.
inimediate mo na lang na parang, paano ba yun? Kunwari,
Magko-collect ng data, ma'am.
hindi
Kung
lang
ano
yan.
yung mga nangyari.
Kunwari, ito yung isang mahirap na problema. Kunwari,
Yes.
sabi ng asawa, binubugbog siya.
Mm.
Sabi nung lalaki, baliw yan eh. Paano mo ngayon na anuhin yun, right? So,
Opo.
si lalaki has a medical certificate. Sa iyo na si babae is emotionally, psychologically unstable. Sabi ni babae, ay hindi, sinuhulan nila yung doktor na yan eh. Paano mo ngayon na yun? So then you have to talk to witnesses.
Yes.
Mediation nga. But at the same time, yung point ko sa earthquake, just because hindi totoo, kunwari, hindi totoo pala yung claim ni babae, balik talaga siya, I think we also need to respect the fact na for her, the pain will be real. Di ba? Kahit nabaliw ako at hindi totoo yung claims ko, totoo sa akin yung nararamdaman ko eh. So yung ganong sensitivity na lang.
Okay. Next question. Okay na ba yan, ma'am? There's another question from Carol. Or Carol, you might want to open your mic and ask your question.
Pero meron din sa chat.
Yes,
After Carol.
well, okay. So from Carol, I observed that many media persons now just echo the official statements of their sources. Hindi na nag-probe, nag-dare ng mga difficult questions. Why is this happening?
Okay, I cannot say why that is happening because that depends on their editors and editorial policies. But I can venture an opinion. Kasi parang yung why, parang factual yun eh. Diba? But why I think this is happening? Okay. Mas madali to echo the official sources. At kasi ang first rule that I learned noon was, if the government said it, it's probably true. That assumption of regularity that government enjoys. Na parang we slowly learn to take also with a grain of salt. Like halimbawa, sa isang incident, merong nagtapo ng granada tapos sumigaw ng NPA kami. Sabi ng pulis, NPA yan eh. Not really. Sumigaw siya ng NPA. How do you know na NPA nga yun? Unless the NPA claims, right? Kasi, so, kaya minsan may mga ganong pagsusulat sa na claimed. Ibig sabihin nun, sinasabi ng reporter na that's the reporter's way of signaling. I don't really know if this is true. Kine-claim lang yan. So why do they echo the official statements? That's one, because of the presumption of regularity. But the question is, bakit hindi sila nag-prove? There are several possibilities. Hindi sila inallow na mag-prove. I have had an experience noon na pagka sa press conference, sinasabihan nila, huli kong magtanong. Kasi yung source namin noon, nagagalit sa akin. So, pagka nagalit siya, mag-walk out siya sa press conference, di wala na makakapagtanong or yung sagot niya doon sa susunod ay pabalang na kasi nagalit na siya. So, may pressure minsan from other reporters to be nice. Ganon. O kaya minsan, hindi rin naisip ng reporter yung difficult question. Kasi, hindi siya sinabihan ng editor niya, itanong mo naman to, bata pa si reporter. Hindi niya na-imagine that the issue should go, but that's a problem. And that's a weakness, and that's a problem that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just to end the discussion on Marawi, not that we don't want to discuss it, no, it's just that we're running out of time. Si Abdul Hamidullah Attar said, I hope that the CHR through Attorney Dana can give time for the Marawi civil society groups to discuss the post-Marawi via right to information towards accountability. Thank you, Attorney. That's just please take note of that. And then there are other questions like from Cesar Villanueva. It's nice to see you back, sir. Attorney Dana, how do we engage the profound challenges from the quantity, speed, and increasing sophistication of online misinformation?
Okay, mahirap yan. Ang tanong is, sino ba ang we? Kasi it has to be engaged on several levels. Like an ordinary individual. How can you distinguish kung ano yung totoo sa hindi? So, ang problema kasi nasanay tayo relying on authorities. So, dati ang authority natin, mainstream media. Kasi supposedly may code of conduct kayo, kasi supposedly you can be held responsible. Pero nung na-discredit ang mainstream media, nagkaroon ng ibang authorities. Diba? The social media influencers. So, authority itong isang tao to kasi naniniwala sa kanya yung nanay ko eh. So, ganun pa rin yung problema with critical thinking. Medyo we relegate yung ano na as your authority. So, whatever she says, paniniwalaan ko na. Okay, sa level ng media, ang ginagawa ng media, nag-attempt sila ng may mga fact-checking websites so that if an ordinary person tries to search for, tries to fact-check something, merong available na information to counter that disinformation. That said, I was in a forum where somebody said na ang problema talaga is there's just too much disinformation. And so, media and other people who want to help really need to produce more fact-checking information and more correct information. Problema rin, as I mentioned, yung online misinformation is free. So if you don't have money to pay for subscription sa news, ang makukuha mo yung mga hindi masyadong nagpa-fact check. So how do we engage? We should try, but I don't think that I have the right answer. I don't know.
Okay. From Risa Fausto of PMPI, I don't know if this is a question. Questions we can also ask ourselves after conducting research. Para kanino naninilbihan ang mga impormasyon na lumalabas? Para saan? Para ba ito sa interes ng iilan o sa bayan? I think that's just a comment.
That's also that's one of one way na you assess a source. Bakit binibigay sa akin tong information na to? Or yun nga, bakit niya sinasabi, may masaserve ba to? Is this person a paid influencer? That's why a lot of people say they're not paid, di ba? Para maging mas credible sila. You know, pero pagkatapos later na-appoint sa government position. So nakita mo kung paano yung naging bayad sa kanya, right? So we have to be conscious always who the information serves.
Okay. So last question because we're out of time already. From Teofilo Laharca, meron po ba tayong authority to call for tayo or kayo? Baka CHR, please can you clarify this, Mr. Laharca? Meron po ba tayong authority to call for or summon parties involved so that a dialogue can be achieved? If not, how do we make a workaround for parties to avoid attendance of a mediation dialogue?
Actually, CHR has the authority to
CHR.
parties. Meron kami we can subpoena. But because it's a mediation dialogue, of course, in the end, the parties can just say, well, we don't want to mediate. Diba? And pagdating doon, deads na kami kasi investigatory body lang kami. We don't have adjudicatory powers. But we also have the powers of, the power of contempt.
You have power, CHR has power of contempt?
Yes. It's
Yes.
It's in our rules of procedure.
So you can, pwede nilang ipakulong yung mga tao na tinawag nila pero ayaw humarap sa kanila.
By filing a case in court pa rin.
Yeah. Okay. So hindi kayo mismo.
Hindi yung diretso na
you can Okay. So with that, thank you very much, Atty. Dana. If there are other questions that if there still are other questions you would like to ask Atty. Dana, please email us or write them down here in our chat box or email us at Mednet. Maglalagay kami ng email address dito and we will send them to her. So thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. As you know, one of the sources of conflict is data gap. And that is Attorney Dana's discussion this afternoon really puts this source of conflict against a larger backdrop.